1872, rural Hertfordshire, England. In the spring of that year, a gravedigger working in the overgrown cemetery of St. Mary's Church unearthed something that would haunt the parish for generations. Beneath the roots of an ancient yew tree, his spade struck not soil, but wood. What emerged was a makeshift coffin, unmarked and positioned far from consecrated ground. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a man, his skull bearing a distinctive fracture. But it was what accompanied him that chilled the workers to their core, a woman's lace handkerchief, monogrammed with initials that matched no burial record in the church's registry. Wrapped within its folds was a lock of auburn hair tied with a ribbon, and a fragment of parchment bearing 4 words in elegant script: "For love, I sinned." The discovery triggered whispers among the elderly villagers, those whose grandparents had lived through the scandal that the parish had worked so diligently to erase from memory. By the time authorities examined the remains, the story had already begun to surface from the murky depths of collective amnesia. What they uncovered was not merely a forgotten burial, but a deliberate concealment, a conspiracy of silence that had protected one of Victorian England's most disturbing crimes. The question that emerged from those shallow graves was not simply who this man was or how he died. The question was far more unsettling. How many people had known the truth, and why had an entire community chosen to bury it alongside the body? This is the story of a murder that society deemed too scandalous to remember, a crime so intertwined with forbidden desire and social transgression that history itself recoiled from recording it. Before we descend into the darkness of what transpired in that quiet English village, tell me where you're listening from and what time is it there. Because what you're about to hear is a reminder that the most horrifying secrets are often those kept by ordinary people in ordinary places. The events that led to that unmarked grave began nearly 3 decades earlier, in 1844, when Hertfordshire was a patchwork of agricultural estates and small villages connected by rutted roads and rigid social hierarchies. The village of Ashwell Cross existed as most rural English communities did, under the watchful governance of the landed gentry, the moral authority of the Anglican Church, and the unspoken laws of propriety that governed every aspect of life. Into this world was born Catherine Hartwell, the 3rd daughter of a modestly successful grain merchant. Her family occupied that precarious middle station between the laboring poor and the genteel classes, respectable enough to maintain appearances, but vulnerable enough that any scandal could demolish the standing entirely. Catherine grew into a striking young woman, possessed of intelligence that found no outlet beyond the parlor and needlework that decorated her prison. Her education, like that of most women of her station, consisted of just enough learning to make her agreeable in conversation, but not so much as to render her threatening to male authority. She could read, though her access to books was carefully curated. She could play the pianoforte adequately, sketch landscapes in watercolor, and recite poetry that celebrated feminine virtue and domestic duty. What she could not do was choose her own path, express her own desires, or question the future that had been mapped for her since birth. In the autumn of 1863, at the age of 19, Catherine was married to Edmund Hartwell, a man 23 years her senior. Hartwell was a solicitor of some local prominence, managing property transactions and legal affairs for several of the county's minor estates. He was neither cruel nor kind, neither passionate nor cold. He was simply what marriage meant for women of Catherine's class. A transaction, a transfer of property from father to husband, with Catherine herself being the primary asset exchanged. The wedding took place in St. Mary's Church on a gray October morning, witnessed by family and neighbors who saw nothing unusual in the considerable age difference or in the bride's pale, composed expression as she spoke her vows. Their home was a 3-story Georgian townhouse on the edge of Ashwell Cross, respectable but not grand, with gardens that Catherine tended with the same dutiful attention she applied to all her wifely obligations. Edmund maintained a study on the ground floor where he conducted his legal work, often entertaining clients late into the evening while Catherine remained upstairs, embroidering by lamplight or reading the few volumes her husband deemed appropriate for feminine consumption. Their marriage produced no children in the first year, nor in the second, a circumstance that began to generate whispers among the village women and furrowed brows from Edmund's family. Edmund Hartwell was a creature of rigid routine and exacting standards. He expected his meals served precisely on time, his household managed with military efficiency, and his wife to be ornamental, compliant, and invisible except when required for social obligations. Catherine learned quickly that her husband's affection, such as it was, depended entirely upon her ability to anticipate his needs and efface her own existence. She became a ghost in her own home, moving through rooms with practiced silence, speaking only when addressed, cultivating the art of invisibility that so many women of her era perfected as a survival mechanism. But something was stirring beneath that carefully maintained surface. Catherine had begun to feel the suffocation of her existence with an intensity that frightened her. The walls of her home seemed to contract with each passing month, the hours stretching into eternities of emptiness, punctuated only by Edmund's demands and society's expectations. She would stand at her bedroom window in the early morning hours, watching the sun rise over fields she could observe but never freely walk through, and feel something dark and desperate coiling in her chest, a hunger for something beyond duty, beyond respectability, beyond the narrow corridor of acceptable feminine existence. It was in the spring of 1866 that Thomas Brennan entered their lives, and with him, the trajectory toward murder began its inexorable course. Brennan was an Irishman, 31 years old, who had come to Hertfordshire seeking work after the death of his father left him without prospects in County Cork. He possessed skills as a carpenter and general laborer, moving between the estates and villages, taking whatever employment he could secure. Edmund Hartwell hired him to construct new bookcases for his expanding legal library and to repair the deteriorating garden wall that bordered their property. Brennan was to work on the premises for approximately 6 weeks, long enough to complete both projects to Edmund's exacting specifications. Thomas Brennan was everything Edmund Hartwell was not. Where Edmund was rigid and controlled, Thomas moved with an easy physicality born of labor and confidence in his own capabilities. Where Edmund spoke in measured, authoritative tones designed to establish superiority, Thomas possessed an accent that sang with the lilt of Ireland and a manner of speaking that suggested conversation rather than decree. He was handsome in an unrefined way, dark-haired, with hands scarred by work and eyes that met others directly rather than with the calculated assessment Edmund employed. For Catherine, who had spent 3 years in a marriage that felt like slow burial, Thomas Brennan's presence in her home was like oxygen suddenly flooding into airless spaces. Their first conversations were innocuous, conducted in the careful formality appropriate between a gentleman's wife and a hired laborer. Catherine would bring tea to the garden where Thomas worked, or inquire about his progress on the bookcases being constructed in Edmund's study. But even these brief exchanges carried an undercurrent that both recognized and neither initially acknowledged. Catherine found herself inventing reasons to pass through whatever part of the house or garden Thomas was working in. Thomas began taking longer on his projects, extending the work beyond what was strictly necessary, finding reasons to remain within the orbit of the woman whose loneliness he could see as clearly as if it were written across her features. By the 4th week of his employment, they had begun speaking more freely, always careful to maintain propriety should anyone observe them, but allowing their conversations to drift toward more personal territory. Thomas spoke of Ireland, of the family he had left behind, of dreams deferred by poverty and circumstance. Catherine, with growing boldness, spoke of her own constrained existence, of books she longed to read that Edmund forbade, of places she would never see, of the person she might have been had she been born male or wealthy or into an era that permitted women autonomous existence. These conversations were themselves a form of intimacy, a dangerous sharing of interior lives that proper society deemed inappropriate between a married woman and any man besides her husband. What developed between Catherine Hartwell and Thomas Brennan was inevitable in the way that fire is inevitable when spark meets tinder in drought conditions. By late May, their relationship had transformed into something that transcended the boundaries of class and propriety. They met in the garden after dark, in the early morning hours when Edmund was still sleeping, in stolen moments, when the solicitor was occupied with clients or away on business. Their affair was conducted with the desperation of people who understood they were transgressing every law that governed their world, yet found themselves unable or unwilling to stop. Catherine experienced something she had never known in her marriage desire that was mutual rather than one-sided obligation. Conversation that treated her as an intellectual equal rather than a decorative inferior. Touch that communicated passion rather than ownership. For Thomas, Catherine represented not just romantic attachment, but a glimpse into a world he had been born outside of, a life of education and refinement that poverty had denied him. They were, in their different ways, both prisoners of their circumstances, and in each other they found temporary escape from the cells that society had constructed around them. But Victorian England did not forgive such transgressions, particularly not for women. The penalties for a wife's adultery were social annihilation, potential criminal prosecution, and complete loss of any legal rights or protections. If discovered, Catherine would be ruined, absolutely cast out from her family, denied any financial support, marked as a fallen woman for the remainder of her existence. Thomas, as a man of lower social standing who had dared to touch a gentleman's wife, faced potential criminal charges and certain blacklisting from any respectable employment. By July 1866, the situation had reached a crisis point. Thomas's work was nearly complete, and Edmund had made clear that he would not be requiring the Irishman's services beyond the current projects. The lovers faced an impossible choice: end their relationship and return to their separate prisons, or find some way to continue what had become, for both of them, the only authentic connection in their carefully circumscribed lives. But there was no legal or social mechanism that would permit them to be together. Divorce was nearly impossible to obtain and carried devastating consequences. Running away together would require resources neither possessed and would leave them fugitives from respectability, unable to settle anywhere without new identities and constant fear of discovery. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and impossibility that another option began to take shape in Catherine's mind, an option so dark that at first she pushed it away, horrified at her own capacity to even conceive of such a thing. But desperation has a way of making the unthinkable, first thinkable, then reasonable, then necessary. And Catherine Hartwell, the grain merchant's daughter who had been taught that her highest purpose was obedience and duty, began to plan her husband's murder. The transformation of Catherine Hartwell from dutiful wife to calculating murderer did not happen in a single moment of decision. It occurred gradually through a series of small moral compromises that led her step by step away from the person she had been raised to be. She began by simply allowing herself to imagine Edmund's absence, what freedom might feel like, how life could unfold without his oppressive presence. These fantasies were initially passive, picturing his death through natural causes or accident, scenarios that would free her without requiring her active participation. But as the days passed and Thomas's departure grew imminent, Catherine's thoughts became more active, more deliberate, more concrete. She started observing her husband with new attention, studying his routines with the focus of someone planning an assault rather than managing a household. Edmund was a creature of unwavering habit. He took his breakfast at precisely 7 o'clock each morning, porridge with cream, toast with marmalade, and strong black tea. He worked in his study from 8 until noon, seeing clients by appointment. He took lunch at 1 o'clock, always the same meal on the same day of the week. Monday was cold roast beef, Tuesday was mutton pie, and so forth through the week in unvarying rotation. He retired to his study again until 6, dined at 7, read legal documents or the newspaper until 9, and was in bed by 10 o'clock. His life was so rigidly structured that Catherine could predict his location and activity at any given moment, an asset that would prove crucial to her plans. Edmund also suffered from chronic digestive complaints, a condition he treated with various tonics and remedies purchased from the local apothecary. He was particular about his medications, insisting they be prepared exactly to specification and administered on schedule. Catherine had managed his medicine cabinet since their marriage, measuring out his evening tonic of laudanum and digestive bitters, ensuring his various powders and elixirs were properly stored and rotated. This responsibility, intended to demonstrate wifely devotion, had given her intimate knowledge of substances that could harm as easily as heal. In early August, Catherine made her first concrete move toward murder. She told Thomas of her intention during one of their clandestine meetings in the garden, speaking in whispers beneath the cover of darkness. His reaction was not what she expected. Thomas initially recoiled from the suggestion, horrified that their affair had led to contemplation of such a crime. He argued they should instead run away together, accept poverty and social exile as the price of their love. But Catherine understood what Thomas, in his masculine optimism, could not fully grasp: that society would hunt them relentlessly, that Edmund would use every legal resource to pursue and punish them, that their lives as fugitives would be brief and brutal. Over the course of several anguished conversations, Catherine wore down Thomas's resistance. She painted vivid pictures of their impossible situation, of the slow death she faced in her marriage, of the only alternative that would truly free them both. She appealed to his love for her, to his anger at the social system that kept them apart, to his own desire for life beyond labor and poverty. She was methodical in her manipulation, though whether she fully recognized it as manipulation or genuinely believed her own arguments remains one of the psychological mysteries of this case. By mid-August, Thomas had progressed from horrified refusal to reluctant acceptance to active participation in planning Edmund Hartwell's death. The method they chose reflected both the constraints of their situation and the substances readily available in a Victorian household. Arsenic was the poison of choice in that era, easily obtained under the guise of pest control and difficult to detect in a body after death, particularly if the symptoms could be attributed to natural illness. Catherine began purchasing small quantities of arsenic-based rat poison from different shops in neighboring villages, careful never to buy too much from any single source or to establish a pattern that might later be recalled. She told shopkeepers she was dealing with a rodent infestation in the kitchen stores, a common enough problem that no one questioned the purchases. The lovers decided against a single massive dose that would kill quickly and obviously. Instead, Catherine would administer small amounts over an extended period, gradually poisoning Edmund so that his death would appear to result from the digestive ailments he already suffered. It was a patient, cold-blooded approach that required nerve and sustained commitment qualities that Catherine discovered she possessed in abundance once she had committed herself to this path. She began adding minute quantities of arsenic to Edmund's evening tonic in late August, measuring carefully to produce symptoms that would progress convincingly from discomfort to serious illness to death. Edmund's decline began with symptoms that seemed entirely consistent with his existing digestive troubles: increased stomach pain, nausea, general malaise. He complained to Catherine that his condition was worsening despite his medications, never suspecting that the very remedies he relied upon were delivering poison into his system. Catherine played the concerned wife with perfect conviction, adjusting his diet to lighter fare, ensuring he rested adequately, summoning the village doctor to examine him. Dr. Pemberton, an elderly physician who had practiced in Ashwell Cross for 40 years, diagnosed an aggravation of Edmund's chronic gastric disorder and prescribed bed rest, bland foods, and continued use of his various tonics, exactly what Catherine had anticipated. As September arrived and Edmund's condition deteriorated further, Thomas completed his work on the Hartwell property and officially concluded his employment. But he did not leave Ashwell Cross. Instead, he took lodging in a boarding house on the village outskirts, finding occasional work that kept him nearby while maintaining the appearance that his connection to the Hartwell household had ended. He and Catherine continued to meet, now with even greater secrecy. As Edmund's illness provided both cover for her movements, she could slip away while he slept heavily under the influence of laudanum-laced tonic and urgency to their situation. By early October, Edmund was seriously ill, confined to his bed, and unable to manage his legal practice. His brother arrived from London to assist with business affairs, a development that complicated Catherine's plans considerably. James Hartwell was sharp-eyed and suspicious by nature, less willing than the village doctor to accept easy explanations. He questioned Catherine closely about Edmund's symptoms, his diet, his medications, and his medical treatment. She answered with the detailed knowledge of a devoted wife, showing him the medicine bottles, the doctor's notes, the careful records she kept of Edmund's food intake and symptoms. James could find no fault in her care, yet something about the situation troubled him in ways he could not articulate. What James Hartwell observed but could not quite interpret were the subtle signs that Catherine was not a grief-stricken wife watching her husband die. She was too composed, too efficient in her nursing duties, performing them with mechanical precision rather than emotional investment. There was no desperate seeking of additional medical opinions, no tearful prayers for recovery, no visible anguish at Edmund's deterioration. Catherine had become an actress playing the role of the devoted wife, but to someone paying close attention, the performance had a hollow quality, as though she were following a script rather than experiencing genuine emotion. The household staff noticed peculiarities as well, though they lacked James Hartwell's perspective to interpret them. The cook remarked to the housemaid that Mrs. Hartwell seemed unusually cheerful for a woman whose husband lay dying upstairs. The housemaid noted that Catherine spent considerable time in the garden at odd hours, often returning with flushed cheeks and disheveled appearance that suggested activities beyond simple walking. The gardener reported seeing a man's figure near the property line after dark on several occasions. These observations circulated through the servant network that connected all the homes in the village, creating a web of gossip that would later prove significant. Edmund Hartwell died on October 23, 1866, after 8 weeks of progressive illness that Dr. Pemberton attributed to acute gastric fever complicated by his pre-existing digestive condition. The death certificate was signed without hesitation, and arrangements were made for burial in St. Mary's churchyard. Catherine received condolences from neighbors and family with appropriate solemnity, dressed in the black crepe of widowhood, and conducted herself with the dignity expected of a respectable widow. James Hartwell returned to London after the funeral, though he departed with unresolved concerns that he shared with no one but his wife. The period immediately following Edmund's death should have been Catherine's careful withdrawal from society into the mourning rituals that Victorian widowhood demanded. She should have remained secluded, receiving only close family, wearing black for a full year, before gradually transitioning through stages of half-mourning that would eventually permit her to re-enter social life. Instead, Catherine began making decisions that struck the village as unseemly at best and suspicious at worst. Within 2 weeks of Edmund's burial, Catherine announced her intention to sell the townhouse and relocate to a cottage she claimed to have inherited from a distant aunt in Derbyshire. The story was plausible enough on its surface, but the speed with which she moved to liquidate her husband's estate raised eyebrows. She sold the house and most of its contents to a buyer from Cambridge, accepted a modest settlement for Edmund's legal practice and client list, and converted everything she could into portable funds. By mid-November, less than a month after her husband's death, Catherine Hartwell had departed Ashwell Cross with 2 trunks of possessions and enough money to live modestly but independently, a freedom virtually unprecedented for a woman of her station. What the village did not know was that Thomas Brennan had departed Ashwell Cross 3 days before Catherine, heading north with his own modest savings and the promise that she would join him once her affairs were settled. They had agreed to meet in the industrial city of Manchester, where two people without histories could more easily disappear into the churning anonymity of factory districts and boarding houses. The plan was for Catherine to travel north as a widow relocating to family, then quietly assume a new identity as Thomas's wife, claiming they had married privately in Ireland before emigrating to England. It was a fragile deception, dependent on distance and the chaos of urban life to obscure their pasts. But history rarely cooperates with murderous plans. In December 1866, James Hartwell received a letter from an acquaintance in Manchester, a businessman with legal dealings that had previously brought him into contact with Edmund. The letter mentioned in passing that he had encountered someone who bore remarkable resemblance to Edmund's widow, seen in the company of a common laborer in circumstances that suggested a relationship incompatible with proper mourning. The observation was offered casually. Perhaps the writer had been mistaken about the woman's identity, but James Hartwell's dormant suspicions ignited into active investigation. James traveled to Manchester and made inquiries among boarding house operators and local shopkeepers. What he discovered confirmed his worst suspicions. Catherine was indeed living in Manchester, not with family in Derbyshire, and she was sharing lodgings with a man she claimed as her husband, though no marriage record existed in any church registry James could locate. More disturbing still, several people recalled seeing the couple together before Edmund's death, suggesting their relationship predated her widowhood. James returned to London and immediately contacted the authorities, demanding that his brother's death be investigated as a potential murder. The wheels of Victorian justice, once set in motion, ground forward with terrible inevitability. In January 1867, Edmund Hartwell's body was exhumed from St. Mary's churchyard and subjected to forensic examination by one of London's leading medical experts in toxicology. The tests were primitive by modern standards, but sufficient for their purpose. Edmund's organs showed unmistakable evidence of arsenic poisoning in concentrations that could only have resulted from deliberate, sustained administration. The conclusion was unambiguous. Edmund Hartwell had been murdered, and the circumstantial evidence pointed directly toward his widow and her lover. Catherine and Thomas were arrested in their Manchester lodgings on a cold February morning. The constables found them in bed together, a circumstance that sealed their guilt in the public imagination before any trial could commence. They were transported separately back to Hertfordshire to face charges of conspiracy to commit murder, with Catherine facing the additional charge of actually administering the poison. The scandal exploded across the county and beyond, reported in newspapers from London to Edinburgh, becoming one of those sensational cases that Victorian society simultaneously condemned and consumed with voyeuristic fascination. The evidence against them was substantial but largely circumstantial. Investigators established that Catherine had purchased arsenic from multiple sources. They documented Thomas's presence in Ashwell Cross and the timing of his movements. They collected testimony from servants about Catherine's suspicious behavior and demeanor. They presented Edmund's exhumed remains and the toxicology findings. But they could not produce any witness who had actually seen Catherine administer poison, nor could they find any written confession or explicit planning documents. The case would rest on the accumulated weight of circumstances and the testimony of witnesses whose observations, taken individually, might seem innocuous, but together painted a damning picture. The trial of Catherine Hartwell and Thomas Brennan commenced in April 1867 at the Hertfordshire Assizes, held in the ancient stone courthouse that had witnessed centuries of human judgment. The proceedings drew crowds that overflowed the gallery, spilled into the corridors, and gathered in the streets outside, desperate for glimpses of the accused or scraps of testimony that might satisfy their hunger for scandal. The case had captured public imagination precisely because it inverted the expected narrative of Victorian crime. Here was no desperate poverty-driven theft, no crime of sudden passion, but rather a calculated murder orchestrated by a woman of respectable station for the purpose of escaping her marriage and continuing an illicit affair. It was the kind of transgression that simultaneously horrified and titillated a society built on rigid moral foundations. Catherine entered the courtroom dressed in black widow's weeds, her face pale and composed, her bearing suggesting dignity rather than shame. Thomas, by contrast, appeared haggard and diminished, his working-class status rendered even more apparent by the formal setting and the stern-faced barristers in their wigs and robes. They were seated separately in the dock, forbidden from speaking to each other, forced to communicate only through glances that the packed courtroom observed and interpreted with ghoulish fascination. The prosecution was led by Sir Richard Hawthorne, a veteran Crown prosecutor known for his methodical destruction of defendants and his particular severity in cases involving women who violated their prescribed social roles. Sir Richard's opening statement laid out the Crown's case with devastating clarity. He described Edmund Hartwell as a respectable solicitor, a pillar of his community whose only fault had been trusting his wife with management of his household and his medications. He painted Catherine as a woman who had betrayed every sacred duty, wife, Christian, member of civilized society, by engaging in adultery, and then, when confronted with the impossibility of continuing her illicit relationship, choosing murder over virtue. Thomas Brennan was portrayed as a predatory lower-class interloper who had seduced a gentleman's wife and then conspired with her to eliminate the obstacle to their shameful union. The prosecutor's language dripped with moral condemnation, transforming what was fundamentally a murder case into a trial about the very foundations of social order and feminine virtue. The prosecution's evidence unfolded over 6 days of testimony that built the circumstantial case piece by methodical piece. The apothecary from a village 12 miles distant testified that Catherine had purchased arsenic-based rat poison in early August, describing how she had paid in cash and left quickly, behavior he now recognized as furtive. 3 other shopkeepers from surrounding villages provided similar testimony, establishing that Catherine had systematically acquired poison from multiple sources to avoid suspicion. The pharmacist who had prepared Edmund's regular medications testified about the contents of those remedies, establishing that none contained arsenic in therapeutic doses. Dr. Pemberton, the elderly physician who had treated Edmund during his final illness, testified with visible distress about the symptoms he had observed and how they aligned with arsenic poisoning rather than the gastric disorder he had diagnosed. Under Sir Richard's questioning, he acknowledged that Edmund's symptoms to severe abdominal pain, vomiting, progressive weakness were entirely consistent with chronic arsenic exposure. He admitted he had not suspected poisoning because Edmund was being cared for by his wife, and the possibility of a spouse as murderer had simply not entered his diagnostic considerations. The physician's testimony was particularly damaging because it established both the mechanism of death and the reason Catherine's crime had gone undetected for so long. The toxicologist from London provided technical testimony about the chemical analysis of Edmund's exhumed remains. Speaking in precise scientific language that had to be translated for the jury, he explained how arsenic accumulates in hair, nails, and internal organs, how the concentrations found in Edmund's body could only have resulted from repeated exposure over weeks, and how the timing aligned with the period when Catherine had been purchasing the poison. He brought samples and diagrams, transforming the courtroom into a makeshift laboratory as he demonstrated the chemical tests that had revealed the presence of arsenic. His testimony removed any possibility that Edmund's death had been natural or accidental. The household staff provided testimony that was devastating in its cumulative effect. The cook described Catherine's emotional state during Edmund's illness as oddly detached, noting she had seemed more focused on maintaining appearances than on genuine concern for her husband's welfare. The housemaid testified about Catherine's frequent absences during evening hours, her disheveled appearance upon returning, and the peculiar fact that she had seemed almost energized rather than exhausted by the demands of nursing a dying man. The gardener described seeing a man matching Thomas Brennan's description lurking near the property on multiple occasions after his employment had officially ended, meetings that could only have been clandestine assignations with Catherine. Neighbors contributed observations that individually seemed innocuous, but together painted a picture of a woman conducting a secret life. Mrs. Pemberton, the doctor's wife, testified that she had seen Catherine walking alone near the village outskirts at dusk, heading in the direction where Thomas had taken lodging. Mr. Ashford, Catherine's own father, provided painful testimony about her hasty departure from Ashwell Cross after Edmund's death, acknowledging that her behavior had struck him as inappropriate, but that he had attributed it to grief affecting her judgment rather than guilt motivating her flight. James Hartwell's testimony provided the final connective tissue that bound all the circumstantial evidence into a coherent narrative. He described his suspicions during Edmund's illness, his investigation in Manchester, and his discovery of Catherine living with Thomas in circumstances that made clear their relationship had existed before Edmund's death. Under Sir Richard's skilled questioning, James reconstructed the timeline that showed Catherine and Thomas had opportunity, means, and overwhelming motive to commit murder. His testimony was particularly effective because he conveyed genuine grief for his brother while methodically presenting evidence that his sister-in-law had killed Edmund with calculated premeditation. The defense, led by a capable but overmatched barrister named Mr. Hollis, faced an impossible task. He could not dispute the arsenic in Edmund's body, nor could he explain away Catherine's purchases of poison or her subsequent flight with Thomas. Instead, he attempted to create doubt about whether Catherine had actually administered the poison and whether Thomas had been a conspirator or merely an unwitting beneficiary of Catherine's crime. Mr. Hollis suggested alternative theories. Perhaps Edmund had accidentally poisoned himself with his various medications. Perhaps a servant with unknown grievances had poisoned him. Perhaps the arsenic in his body had come from environmental exposure rather than deliberate administration. These alternative theories collapsed under the weight of evidence and logic. The prosecution demonstrated that Edmund's medicine cabinet had been under Catherine's exclusive control, that no servant had access to his food or medications without her supervision, and that the concentrations of arsenic in his body were far too high to result from accidental exposure. Mr. Hollis's attempts to portray Catherine as a devoted wife, driven to desperate measures by an unhappy marriage, fell flat in the face of testimony about her methodical planning and her immediate flight into Thomas's arms after Edmund's death. Catherine herself did not testify, a decision that Mr. Hollis made to protect her from Sir Richard's cross-examination, but which many interpreted as evidence of guilt. Thomas did take the stand, a catastrophic decision that destroyed what little remained of their defense. Under Sir Richard's brutal questioning, Thomas attempted to protect Catherine by claiming sole responsibility for conceiving the murder plot, insisting that he had manipulated and coerced her into participating, but his testimony contradicted established facts and his own previous statements to police. He became confused and contradictory, at times claiming Catherine had been an unwilling participant, at other times admitting they had planned together, ultimately creating the impression of someone desperately lying to save a woman he loved. The most damaging moment came when Sir Richard confronted Thomas with a letter Catherine had written to him in September 1866, while Edmund still lived. The letter had been discovered hidden in Thomas's lodgings during his arrest. In it, Catherine wrote in coded but unmistakable language about their plans, referring to the obstacle being removed soon and our new life together once I am free. The letter demonstrated premeditation, conspiracy, and cold-blooded calculation. When confronted with this evidence, Thomas broke down entirely, weeping openly in the witness box, unable to maintain his protective lies in the face of Catherine's own written words. The trial concluded with closing arguments that crystallized the two competing narratives. Sir Richard delivered a thundering condemnation of Catherine and Thomas as moral monsters who had violated every law of God and man, who had conspired to murder an innocent man for no reason beyond their own selfish gratification, and who deserved the fullest measure of justice society could impose. Mr. Hollis made a passionate but ultimately futile appeal for mercy, arguing that Catherine had been trapped in a loveless marriage, that society's rigid constraints had left her no honorable escape, that her crime, while terrible, emerged from desperate circumstances rather than inherent evil. His argument might have resonated in a different era, but in Victorian England, it merely confirmed Catherine's guilt while attempting to excuse it. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. Catherine Hartwell was found guilty of murder. Thomas Brennan was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, sobs, and satisfied murmurs. Catherine received the verdict with the same eerie composure she had maintained throughout the trial, her face betraying no emotion beyond a slight tightening around her eyes. Thomas collapsed entirely, held upright only by the constables flanking him. The judge, Lord Justice Pemberton, scheduled sentencing for the following day, though everyone present understood that the sentence for murder in Victorian England carried only one possible outcome. Lord Justice Pemberton delivered Catherine's sentence with a severity that reflected both legal necessity and moral condemnation. She was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out at the county prison in accordance with the law. Thomas Brennan, as a conspirator rather than the principal actor, received a sentence of penal servitude for life to be served in one of the harsh labor prisons that ground men down through years of brutal work and deprivation. Catherine listened to her sentence without visible reaction. The witnesses reported that she reached out toward Thomas as if to touch him one final time before being led away. They would never see each other again. The newspapers exploded with coverage that reflected Victorian society's obsession with women who transgressed their prescribed roles. The Times described Catherine as a monster in feminine form, whose pretty face concealed a heart of purest evil. The Illustrated London News published elaborate engravings of key trial moments, allowing readers across the nation to consume every detail of the scandal. Penny Dreadfuls produced lurid fictional accounts that bore only passing resemblance to actual events, transforming Catherine into everything from a seductress who had bewitched innocent men to a cunning poisoner who had murdered multiple husbands. The case became a cultural phenomenon, referenced in sermons about the dangers of feminine wickedness and cited in medical journals as evidence of moral insanity in women. Catherine's family was destroyed by the scandal. Her father's business collapsed as customers withdrew their patronage, unable to associate with the family of her convicted murderers. Her sisters, unmarried and now effectively unmarriageable, faced social exile that would shatter them for life. Her mother suffered what contemporaries described as a complete nervous collapse and spent her remaining years in seclusion. The Ashford family name became synonymous with shame in Hertfordshire, a cautionary tale about the hidden corruption that might lurk behind respectable facades. In the weeks between sentencing and execution, Catherine was permitted visits from clergy who sought to secure her repentance and spiritual redemption. She met with the prison chaplain daily, engaging in theological discussions that reportedly frustrated the clergyman because Catherine seemed more interested in debating the justice of laws that gave women no legal existence separate from their husbands than in confessing her sins and seeking forgiveness. She wrote letters during this period, though most were intercepted by prison authorities and deemed too inflammatory for delivery. One letter that survived, written to a former school friend, contained a passage that revealed the complexity of her psychology. "I do not claim innocence, for I am guilty as charged, but I claim context. I claim that the cage does not excuse itself by pointing to the desperation of the bird that gnaws through the bars." The execution was scheduled for dawn on July 3rd, 1867, to be carried out within the prison walls, as was customary by that date. Public executions had been common early in the century, but reforms had moved the spectacle behind prison walls, though crowds still gathered outside to mark the moment of death. Catherine spent her final night writing, though the documents she produced were confiscated and later destroyed by authorities who deemed them too subversive to allow into public circulation. According to the prison chaplain's account, she remained composed until the very end, walking to the scaffold with steady steps, refusing the offered hood, and meeting her death with open eyes. Thomas Brennan was transported to Portland Prison, one of the harshest penal facilities in England, where he would spend the next 2 decades breaking rocks in the quarries that gave the prison its name. Records indicate he survived the brutal conditions but emerged a broken man, released in 1887 at age 52 with health destroyed by years of hard labor and deprivation. He returned to Ireland, settled in a remote village, and lived the remainder of his life in obscurity, dying in 1904 without ever speaking publicly about Catherine or the crime that had bound them together and destroyed their lives. But the story's most disturbing revelation came decades after Catherine's execution, when renovations to the Hartwell townhouse uncovered a hidden compartment in Catherine's former writing desk. Inside, investigators found a diary that Catherine had kept during the months of Edmund's poisoning, a document so psychologically revealing that authorities initially suppressed it, fearing it would inspire other discontented wives to similar crimes. The diary was eventually deposited in the county archives, where it remained largely forgotten until historians rediscovered it in the 1920 seconds. What the diary revealed was that Catherine had documented her crime with scientific precision, recording each dose of arsenic, each of Edmund's symptoms, her own psychological state, and her reasoning at every stage of the murder. The diary entries were chilling not because they revealed a monster, but because they revealed someone who understood exactly what she was doing and why, someone who had weighed the moral cost against the price of continued existence in her marriage and concluded that murder was the more bearable option. She wrote with clarity about the impossibility of her situation, the legal and social constraints that gave her no legitimate exit, and her calculation that death by hanging was preferable to slow death through suffocation of everything that made her human. The diary transformed the narrative from a simple tale of wicked woman and illicit passion into something far more disturbing, a documentation of how social structures can create circumstances where murder becomes, from certain perspectives, a rational choice. The diary also revealed that Catherine had attempted other escapes before resorting to murder. She had written to women's reform advocates seeking advice about leaving an unhappy marriage, receiving responses that confirmed she had no legal recourse. She had consulted with a solicitor about her rights, only to learn she had essentially none. Her property belonged to Edmund, her body belonged to Edmund, even her children had she borne any would have belonged entirely to Edmund. The law offered her no protection, no autonomy, no escape. The diary documented her progressive realization that within the legal and social framework of Victorian England, she was not a person but a possession, and the only way to reclaim personhood was to eliminate her owner. This revelation profoundly complicated the historical understanding of the case. Catherine Hartwell was unquestionably a murderer who had poisoned her husband with premeditation and calculation. But she was also a victim of a social and legal system that treated women as property, denied them autonomy, and offered no legitimate means of escape from oppressive circumstances. The case became a focal point for early feminist activists who argued that Catherine's crime, while indefensible, illuminated the violence inherent in Victorian marriage law and the desperate measures women might resort to when all legal avenues were closed. The diary's existence transformed Catherine from a simple villain into a deeply troubling figure who forced uncomfortable questions about complicity, agency, and the relationship between law and justice. The village of Ashwood Cross never recovered from the scandal. The Hartwell townhouse stood empty for years, acquiring a reputation for being haunted by Edmund's ghost seeking revenge or Catherine's spirit unable to find peace. It was eventually demolished in 1889, the land sold and subdivided. Street. Mary's church quietly removed Edmund's headstone and relocated his remains to an unmarked grave in the unconsecrated section where the gravedigger would discover them in 1872, triggering the revival of the whole sordid tale. The church records were altered to obscure the location of his burial, an institutional amnesia that reflected the community's desperate desire to forget what had happened within their midst. Why did this case vanish so completely from collective memory despite its sensational nature? The answer lies in what it revealed about Victorian society itself. The Catherine Hartwell case was a mirror that reflected back uncomfortable truths about the legal subjugation of women, the cruelty embedded in social propriety, and the ways respectable society created the very conditions that generated such desperate crimes. It was easier to forget than to confront these implications. The case was too morally ambiguous, too challenging to the foundations of Victorian domestic ideology, too revealing of the violence that underlay conventional marriage. So it was buried both literally in that unmarked grave and figuratively in the collective amnesia that overtook the village and the county. The story of Catherine Hartwell and Thomas Brennan is not a simple tale of good versus evil, victim versus villain. It is a historical documentation of how legal and social structures can constrain human life so completely that murder becomes conceivable, how desperation can transform ordinary people into criminals, and how society punishes those who transgress while refusing to examine the systems that generate such transgression. Catherine died on the scaffold for her crime, but the laws that made her a non-person, the social structures that offered her no escape, the moral framework that valued her obedience over her humanity, all of these survived unexamined and unchanged. The grave, discovered in 1872, sparked a brief revival of interest, covered in several regional newspapers, but even then the full story was not told. The diary remained hidden in archives, the complexity of the case reduced to sensational headlines about a poisoning wife and her lover. By the early 20th century, the case had faded almost entirely from memory, mentioned only in specialized legal texts about arsenic poisoning cases and occasionally in feminist histories as a footnote about women's legal status in Victorian England. Today, walking through what remains of Ashwell Cross, you will find no marker indicating what transpired there. The cemetery where Edmund was originally buried has headstones dating back centuries, but none bearing the Hartwell name. The site of their townhouse is now a small commercial building housing a tea shop and a bookstore. The boarding house where Thomas lodged was demolished decades ago. History has effectively erased the physical evidence of these lives and this crime, but in the county archives, Catherine's diary still exists. Her handwriting still legible, her voice still speaking across more than a century and a half, documenting not just a murder but a system that created murderers. So what truths remain buried in the silence of history? How many other Catherine Hartwells existed in Victorian England and beyond? Women who found no legal escape from oppressive circumstances, who faced impossible choices between slow annihilation and desperate action. How many crimes did society generate through its own structural violence, then punish while refusing to examine its own complicity? These are the questions Catherine Hartwell's case forces us to confront, questions that remain uncomfortably relevant as we examine the ways legal and social structures still constrain lives, still create impossible situations, still generate the desperation that drives people to unthinkable acts. The forbidden affair that led to murder was not just a story of illicit passion and calculated poisoning. It was a story about what happens when human beings are denied autonomy, agency, and legitimate means of escape from circumstances that threaten to destroy them. Catherine Hartwell made a choice that was morally indefensible, but she made it within a framework that was itself morally indefensible. That uncomfortable truth is what history tried to bury alongside Edmund's body in that unmarked grave. Before you move on from this story, I want you to consider something. If you found yourself in a situation where every legal avenue was closed, where society offered no legitimate escape, where your choices were reduced to slow death or desperate action, what would you do? It's easy to condemn Catherine Hartwell from the comfort of a century and a half of distance. It's harder to confront the reality that systems still exist, that place people in impossible situations, that the dynamics of power and constraint that generated her crime still operate in different forms today. If this story unsettled you, if it made you think about the relationship between law and justice, between social structure and individual agency, between the violence of oppression and the violence of resistance, then share it with someone who might benefit from thinking about these questions too. These forgotten histories survive only if we refuse to let them be buried again. Only if we are willing to examine the uncomfortable truths they reveal about the societies that generated them and the legacies those societies left us. The past is not a distant country with no connection to our present. It is the foundation we stand on, the inheritance we live with, the context that shapes everything we assume to be normal and natural. Catherine Hartwell's story reminds us that what seems normal and natural in any given era can be profoundly unjust, and that the people who transgress against such systems are not always villains. Sometimes they're desperate human beings trapped in circumstances we can barely imagine,